stigmas about mental health issues. And from my experience for too long, those in the mental health world have wanted to ignore the faith and spiritual side of things, and those sometimes in the church we want to forget about mental health. So neither side has been too helpful with each other sometimes. And so I think it's great that we're doing this. Also, I think it's vital because we are God's children made in His image, and we still struggle with issues. And so it's important that we try to deal with those. I did want to say I did not have the pleasure of knowing Travis. I have heard wonderful things about him. I have friends who did know him, so it is an honor to be here in his honor, and it's also wonderful to meet Ashley. She and I had a nice conversation this week. So what we're going to do this evening is I'm going to start off presenting a little bit of general information about mood disorders, about bipolar disorder, and then Ashley will share a lot of her experiences and her thoughts as we go through this process. So start off with just some general information. That is, what is a mood? You know, it's clinically, we talk, sometimes in non-clinical terms, we talk about someone being moody. We also talk about their emotions. Okay. Last time I was up here, I didn't do it. Okay. We often talk about someone being moody. That normally equates to their emotions and their feelings. But in clinical terms, that's not what a mood is. A mood or a mood disorder is not just about feelings and emotions. Feelings and emotions change pretty quickly. A mood disorder is something that happens over time, where a mood has both internal aspects and external aspects. Because our mood, how we interact in the world, can be affected by things outside and also be affected very much by things inside. So, mood disorders are biologically based disorders. It's not just what happens out here, it's the biology that happens inside. They're not really based on emotion. Disrupted emotions, disrupted feelings are often characteristics of individuals who have a mood disorder, but they're not the definition and not the diagnosis of a mood disorder. For many years, in the diagnostic world, there were basically two mood disorders identified. One was major depression, the other was mania. And so you have the opposite ends of the spectrum of mood. And so that's how we came up with the idea of bipolar 1 being mania and depression or major depression being the other end. And the idea was that someone who had a bipolar disorder went between those two ends. That's the reason it was originally called manic depressive disorder. And so you would see these big mood swings. However, those mood swings didn't always happen fast, but sometimes they did. And so sometimes it's hard to know what is going to trigger that mood swing. And the thing we need to understand is that the individual who struggles with a mood disorder can't control their mood disorder. They can't just say, I'm not going to do this. I'm not going to feel this way. I'm not going to experience this way. So some of the things I want to try to tell you today is a little bit about how a person who struggles with a mood disorder, how they present, what they're doing with. One way that as people would look at it is not about emotions, but about energy. Because people who have a major depressive disorder typically have low energy. And I'll go through a whole lot more symptoms of that in just a second. People who have mania typically have lots of energy, both positive and negative. And then in the middle is kind of the worst of both ends, and that's something called a mixed state, where they may have both high energy and low energy, along with high mood and low mood. And so that's something that is, in my experience, is one of the worst for people who have one of these disorders, is to have both at the same time. An accurate diagnosis of a mood disorder, especially a bipolar disorder, is a complicated process. It's not based on just how that individual is at that point at any one point in time. It really looks at the pattern of behaviors over time and the patterns of what they do over time. Typically, there's a genetic or family history. Almost, not always, but almost always, that is true, which ties it even more to being a biological disorder. And in order for someone to meet the criteria for a bipolar 1 disorder, they have to have had at least one manic episode somewhere in their life. And I'll talk about what a manic episode looks like in a minute. Typically also, you have to have at least one episode of major depression. Now, I want to be clear, major depression is not I'm feeling down. It's not I'm feeling sad. It's not just based on that emotion. Major depression, individual, one of the questions is asked is that, do they report that they feel sad, empty, down, hopeless, most of the day and nearly every day for at least 2 weeks? Most of us have had that question asked when we go to our primary care doc and they're doing a physical. They have a checklist and they ask us that question. But that is a part of the process of identifying a mood disorder or major depressive disorder, is that they have had depression that lasts intensely for at least 2 weeks of duration, consecutive. The other thing is that they're looking at the inability to enjoy things. So if a person has a sudden change where they can no longer enjoy the things they used to do for at least 2 weeks in duration. That's also part of the diagnosis for major depression. So typical symptoms of individuals who struggle with major depressive disorder are things like low energy, slow thinking, low motivation, flat or non-existent emotions. They may be crying, they may be sad, they may not be crying, they may not be sad. They oftentimes feel like things will never get better. They have apathy where they don't care. They feel empty inside. Their concentration is poor. Their sleep is disturbed. They feel worthless. And the thing that depression often does is it leads them to blame themselves, where they feel responsible for what happens. They feel responsible for how they feel, but yet they can do little about it. Mania, on the other hand, is pretty much the opposite end of that spectrum. They have increased energy, oftentimes driven to do things. They have an excited mood, also have irritability, hyperactivity, extreme impulsiveness, decreased need for sleep or no sleep. Just don't sleep for 3 days at a time. See how that works for you. Because what it's going to do is it's going to affect the way you think. You actually start dreaming while you're awake if you don't sleep for 2 or 3 days. They also, individuals who are having a manic kind of episode will have increased confidence to the point where they may feel like they can do things that other people can't do. They may think that they have special powers, or they're getting special messages that other people are not getting from God or from the universe. They have racing thoughts often. They can't keep up with them. They're talking faster. They can be hyper-focused or easily distracted. And they often have lots of anxiety. Does that sound like fun to anyone? And so you can imagine bouncing back and forth between that extreme high level of energy to the extreme low level of energy. Now, as I said, when we first started off doing diagnosis, we looked at only these 2 factors. We looked at mania and we looked at depression. What we now know is there's a whole spectrum of disorders in between. There's something they call cyclothymia, which is just not quite as intense. There's hypomania. Hypomania sounds fun. It's that idea that you imagine a day you may feel a little hypomanic, because many of us do. Most people do have a normal reaction to. So think of the day you got married, or the day your child was born, or the day your child got married, or a day where your team just won whatever national championship, and you're on top of the world, and your thoughts are coming fast, and you're thinking clearly, and everything's just popping right along. Well, that's hypomania, and it feels really good for a short period of time, until the anxiety kicks in. Now, it's normal to have hypomanic moments for all of us. Many of us do. That's not an abnormal thing. It's not an indication that we have a disorder. That's just a matter of that's how our mood may go. It's not normal if it stays that way or if it goes back and forth. All right, so I'm trying to figure out how much here to cover right quick. So, as I indicated, the diagnosis of the bipolar disorder is complicated and it takes time. There's lots of variability within the diagnosis. There are also some very common features that people don't realize, and that is that when we describe someone who has a bipolar disorder, when we describe their emotions and their feelings, we can put the word intense in front of whatever they're feeling. So if they're happy, they tend to be intensely happy. If they're sad, they tend to be intensely sad. If they're joyous, it's intensely joyous. If it's frustrated, it's intensely frustrated. I think if they were just feeling calm, they'd feel intensely calm. And it's not, once again, it's not within their control. They feel that intensity within them. They're also very sensitive to their own senses. They may see color. Many people will describe seeing colors more vividly. Many people will describe hearing music more clearly. I've known people who could, listen to an orchestra and pick out not just know that somebody was off a note, but know who. Which, that's beyond most of us. I know people who could literally look at a painting, but look at a painting back here and could tell me how many shades of blue there are there, and how much gray is in that blue, and how much yellow is in that blue, and how much green is in that blue. And I'm like, okay, that's blue to me. But they can do that. That have their sensitivity. Many of them have a very sensitive sense of taste or sense of smell. So they have a greater understanding of emotion, of feelings and of senses with all of those. And so with that, so you have now this high intensity of emotion, high intensity of senses. And then so what ends up happening is these individuals often react to situations more intensely than when they want to, or more intensely than maybe the situation merits. And because of their sensitivity, they're somewhat aware of that. And so they all walk around doing one of two things. They're either apologizing all over themselves because they think they've hurt people's feelings, or they're being prickly and defensive themselves and lashing out because they think somebody's angry at them. And where that idea that someone might be angry at them is probably one of the most interesting things that research has found. And that is individuals with a bipolar, especially a bipolar 1 disorder, will misinterpret facial gestures more than 50% of the time. They don't read what is in people's faces well. And so because they misinterpret it, they almost always misinterpret it that the other person is angry or upset with them. Now during the early days of COVID in 2021, 22, when people were walking around wearing masks a lot more often, I had clients come to me and say, Ben, I don't know, I can't read anything. I know I misread people's facial gestures. They understood that about themselves. But all they could see was someone's eyes. They couldn't see their face, they couldn't see their nose. So you think about, all you can see is someone's eyes, and we're in the early days of COVID when we're all scared because we don't know how it's transmitted. And so people are walking around scared. You can't tell the difference in scared and angry by someone's eyes. And so it was a really hard time for folks who have a bipolar disorder trying to figure out what everybody else was doing and saying. The other thing is that because of their sensitivity, they often take on and absorb other people's emotions. And then it gets multiplied within them back out. Once again, does this sound like a fun place to be? No. These individuals struggle. It's a really hard place to be. Now the good news is there is treatment. There's very good treatment. The sad news is, I think the average is from the time someone is initially diagnosed to they're fully stabilized with medication and treatment is 3 to 5 years. And that's really a long time. And part of the problem is typically treatment comes with a combination of medications and counseling. Medication-wise, we have some ideas of what it's going to take that might be helpful, but yet I've yet to find anyone who's willing to do what it might take to make it work really well. There's no blood test, and no one wants to allow a physician to take a large gauge needle and put it in their brain and pull out some of their brain fluid and figure out exactly what the chemicals are that meet needed. No one's volunteered for that. So it's a kind of a hit and miss. We have ideas of what it can work and what should work, but everybody's a little bit different. So it takes time. And meanwhile, their life is going on. And people can still be on the right medications and still struggle. Because what one of the physicians I used to work with said, the medication does a really good job. We put that with counseling. It does a really good job of helping people manage the external part of their disorder. Manage how they interact with others. Manage how they interact in the world. What it does not do a good job of is managing their own thought process. All of the things that are going on with mania that I listed, of the impulsiveness, the impulsive thoughts, the questioning, all of that continues. So it continues to be a struggle for many of them because they feel like, and many of them have said, I feel like I can't trust my own brain. Okay. So I could go on and on, but I don't want to. I want to give Ashley time to tell you her experiences, her story. Because living with someone with bipolar disorder affects people greatly. And as she and I were talking, truly, as Travis did, people do all the right things and it still does not always work out. So give her some time to share what she wants to say. We may have some time at the end for some questions and answers as well. It's kind of a conversation.
Hey y'all. Just thank you. I feel like in the conversation we had earlier this week for 15 minutes, and now that too, I feel like I have so many things about Travis and our experience together make more sense to me now, and that sense is really life-giving. So if you know me, you know I'm long-winded. So if you went to the memorial service, you know that I was able to talk for like 30 minutes. So fortunately or unfortunately for you, I've written quite a lot. And it's going to take about 25 minutes. Ben can jump in, or I'm also, if you want to raise your hand and ask questions in the middle of me talking, I can also pause. And basically, what I'm sharing today is how I saw bipolar disorder affect Travis, what it looked like in our family, which ultimately is actually the story of us being a couple. So, so I appreciate just listening and being able to share. And obviously, again, thank you for hosting this whole series and for the ways that you've shown love to our family and now to your community by educating people about this illness. I want to start off by saying something that sounds sort of contradictory and maybe even surprising, and that's that even though bipolar disorder is what killed Travis and made him suffer, it's also part of what made him the really wonderful person that he was. Because folks with bipolar disorder, as Ben was saying, they tend to feel emotions intensely, they tend to be deeply empathetic. And this was Travis. When you suffered, he was willing to sit in that pain with you. And when you felt joy or excitement, or just had a funny story to tell, he joined your excitement and then some, right? He was an intense person, but most of the time, full of intense joy. And folks with bipolar disorder also tend to be extremely creative, intelligent, thoughtful. They're often charismatic, and they have an energy that draws you in. And this was Travis. And I'm going to talk today too that I believe that Travis's bipolar disorder also opened him up to connecting with God in ways that I don't think are available to all of us. It allowed him to experience God and the unknowable in ways that we can't. But often these spiritual experiences were very ungrounding for him, and I will share some of those. So that's just to say I have a really complicated view of bipolar disorder because it's also a part of who he was, and I love him. So in college, Travis he'd always been the kid who seemed like he didn't fully have his feet on the ground. He always was living in another reality, creating things, music, art, poetry, competitive sports. And he loved to learn about and get carried away by the theories that we were learning about in our classes, and all the projects he was working on. And me and my college friends, we loved getting carried away with him, but by the time we graduated, I had kind of become the person that everyone knew was Travis's grounding, right? So I was the one who made sure he didn't read about string theory and he didn't watch The Matrix because he needed to know what was real, because sometimes he could really get carried away. And and I always thought of these as his sort of quirks, and they were, but they're also a part of how I could see, even before his first manic episode, his bipolar disorder shaping his brain. His first manic episode was obviously very different. It was very marked from his sort of uniquenesses. And it occurred when he was 23, a couple months after we graduated and got married. Travis had gone to a party one night with some coworkers, and he didn't come back, which was very uncharacteristic. And so then when he did come home the next morning, I found myself actually not relieved because I could tell that something was wrong. He was extremely agitated. And he tried to eat, he tried to sleep, and he couldn't. And so I pressed him to find out if something had happened at the party, and he did say that at the party he had eaten some psychoactive mushrooms, and that had disconnected him from reality. So then, in turn, he smoked some weed to try to bring him back down, which the research out there right now is basically very clear that these kind of psychoactive substances, once they get into the brain of someone who already has bipolar disorder but doesn't know it, this can often lead to the first manic episode. But Travis didn't know he had bipolar disorder. So we sort of just thought, you just need time and sleep, and eventually these drugs will get out of your system. But he did not improve. He got much worse. So after the second night of not sleeping, he told me that he was seeing people climbing up the walls of our apartment, and so I called his parents, and we took him to his primary care provider, who provided him with sleeping pills and just said, he needs to sleep off the effects of these drugs. But the sleeping pills didn't work. And after the fourth day of not sleeping, Travis was in full psychosis, just completely disconnected from reality. So his mom was driving him back to the doctor, and Travis threw his head into the windshield as his mom was driving, jumped out of the moving car, and laid down in the middle of a multi-lane Texas highway. Miraculously, and I really mean that word, traffic stopped before he was hit. So they took him to the hospital, and though his parents and I were thankful that his physical injuries were very minor, he was completely disconnected from reality. He was strapped to a gurney, screaming at us, yelling at us, and he was deemed a suicide risk. And here I want to clarify that suicide in this case is not really the exact right word, because as Travis later explained to us, he didn't wish to die in this moment. he was convinced that he was trapped in his sort of delusion, his manic delusion, was that he was trapped in the wrong reality, and that God was offering a portal for him to enter into the real, the ultimate reality and be with God. And that portal was his mom's windshield. And this became a really common theme in his manic delusions, that he needed to be reborn or enter into, jump into, through this like open window or portal, that God was inviting him to this rebirth so he could finally be perfected and be with God. And I think this is the delusion that ultimately led to his death as well. So with this first manic episode, he was admitted to the only psychiatric hospital with an available bed. We were lucky that it was local, and because it's not always local. When we got to visit him on the second day, he was so sedated that he couldn't talk. And I remember going home and just being terrified, because I really didn't know like if he was coming back. I didn't know if there was like another side to this. But after the fourth day that he'd been there, he'd had enough sedatives, he'd been able to sleep and eat and take a shower, and so signs of him were sort of coming back. And the attending psychiatrist ultimately diagnosed him with drug-induced psychosis, and he got released on the end of the fourth day. And we were just elated, right? Because this was not gonna happen again. This was just drug related, like just don't take drugs ever again. It had been really traumatic, but we were all ready to just, leave it behind. And as Ben was saying, this is a really extremely common scenario where folks with bipolar disorder don't get diagnosed for their first episode, because you have to already have an episode to have the diagnosis. And mania also often begins with an extreme disturbance in sleep. It's also really common for folks' first manic episode to happen somewhere between the ages of 18 and 25. And there's some research out there, but some of the sort of working theories from what I've read, and Ben can speak to this better than I can, obviously, that there's suggestion that there's sort of a shift in hormones at this point in time, but also people in this age group tend to not be sleeping great because they're up partying and studying and whatever, and they also tend to experiment with drugs at this point in time in their age, and all that stuff together probably contributes to this being the age of first mania. And it's also really common for them not to be diagnosed for, on average, 6 to 9 years after their first manic episode. So after that, really, for the next 6 years, every now and then Travis would have a bad night of sleep, and we'd get kind of like, let's just calm down, get some sleep, you'll be fine. And he was, and we kind of didn't think about it much. And then 6 years after the initial episode, and I would assume that this is also pretty common, I don't know, that there can be big year gaps in between episodes, which is part of why it takes a while to diagnose, I would assume. Travis had another episode of acute mania. So at the time, he was working as the co-leader of a Methodist college ministry when we were living in Bloomington, Indiana. And he and I had just returned home we were leading the college students in a mission trip together. If you've ever led a mission trip, you don't sleep very much and you work really hard. And so we were exhausted. And the last night that we were there, we stayed up late talking to the leaders of the organization that we had volunteered with. And they were telling us that their stories, basically, of how they had been called to give up everything in their life as they knew it and to follow God in radical ways and serve the poor of their city. And they shared these beautiful stories of God's revelation to them and of their work in the world. And Travis didn't sleep that night. And by the time we returned home, got all the kids home, back from the mission trip, he began talking about this belief that he was also being called to something radical, that we were being called, and that we needed to listen and follow. and he didn't sleep that night. And then the next morning, the second night that he hadn't slept, he was speaking more like a prophet. So he was seeing visions, receiving messages from God, that we needed to stop what we were doing and we needed to serve. And he was highly agitated, so he would go in one moment from just being full of pure elation, like he had just, heard the voice of God and felt a closeness to God, like a mystic or a saint. And then like 2 minutes later, he would just be like beating his chest and crying because the message was that he had not done enough. And so in all of this, I'm still operating under the assumption that he doesn't have a diagnosis. I just thought he hadn't slept well. So I convinced him to go to the ER, which was actually really hard to do because he was convinced this was not a problem. And he didn't want the revelations to stop because he thought this was like God calling him. But I did get him to go to the ER. Again, they prescribed sleeping pills, said it was a lack of sleep. In this case, the sleeping pills actually did work. And basically, he was able to sleep. And over the course of the week, he started sort of stabilizing. So this time, the takeaway from the manic episode, which I didn't realize was a manic episode, just was that Travis had to be really careful about his sleep, and he needed to avoid late night faith conversations. And then we went on with our lives. Now I want to pause here to say something that I think is super relevant to a conversation about faith and mental illness, but especially bipolar disorder, or any mental illness that involves psychosis. So the tricky thing about Travis throughout his illness was that there was often a really unclear line between delusions caused by his illness, the brain disease, and then the whispers, the revelation, the work of God and the Holy Spirit. We are called to listen and follow Jesus. We are called to do, at times, radical things in the name of faith and God. We are encouraged to listen and look for the invisible and the hidden, to be open to revelation and calling, to believe and work for a kingdom that is not fully realized here in this world. And this is language that we all know, and we use it regularly as Christians and in the church. But obviously, this was deeply ungrounding for Travis. And so honestly, he and I too, honestly didn't know when it was a brain disease talking and when it was the Holy Spirit. And nobody could know that, right? And that's incredibly scary, but it's also really hard because rather than Travis's faith being a source of meaning and strength and stability, his faith became a source of ungrounding, of destabilization, confusion, and even fear. And then eventually my role as his partner was to ground him. So this meant, for example, when Travis came home from work and he had stories to share about how God had spoken to him through a client and then someone at the grocery store and then a bird he had seen outside of his window and how it all fit together as a beautiful message from God, I felt like I had to be the one suspicious of all of these revelations. That I had to tell him it wasn't a message from God, it wasn't all connected, he was not being called or revealed something, the world was not as mystical as he thought. But of course the world is mystical and magical, and God can speak through people and birds and the everyday wonders of life. My role in his grounding then was really challenging to my own faith and my own experience of spiritual wonder and connection with God, because I had become regimented to be suspicious and oppose anything mystical or spiritual that Travis shared with me, because it all had to be concrete. And what that did to me was basically close me off to God and to the whispers of the Holy Spirit. But it also made me the person who closed Travis off to those things, and that was incredibly difficult for our relationship. And I do think it's possible that his brain disease did something to make him more open to actual connections from God, not just delusions. But again, there's a very fine line between these things. And I will also add that Travis had internalized a shame, but learning about how folks with bipolar disorder so easily assume that others are angry at them. So shame was sort of his go-to emotion, or I'm not sure his sort of assumption. He had deep shame. I think in part because of his bipolar disorder, but then I think because it was a kind of shame that was sort of familiar to some degree with his Christian upbringing. He had shame that his faith wasn't deep enough, that he wasn't doing enough to help others. That was the other really big one. And he just never felt like he was doing enough. And though he knew logically that grace is not something that is earned, that's how grace works, he still felt like he had to do more and be better to be worthy of it. And I think, of course, Christian culture can at times distort this universality and freeness of grace and make us believe that it has to be earned. So Travis was sort of always assuming not only that he was angering other people, but most importantly, angering God. And the night before he died, he did tell me that he had missed a window for God's grace. And I think perhaps this is where we can see a line between the voice of God and the delusion of a brain illness. Perhaps the Holy Spirit was whispering, I love you, you're enough, I'm all around you in this beautiful world, I'm connecting you to all these people. But it was the delusions of his brain disease that shouted loudly, you are not enough. Grace is not yours. You are hurting people. You are disappointing people. And in the last years of his life, these delusions were so loud that no matter how many times I told Travis that grace was his and God loves him, he could not believe it. His brain wouldn't let him. He became unreachable. So I'm just going to sort of close by telling you just a little bit about the diagnosis and then sort of the last few months of Travis's life. And I could write a book about all of this, but I'll just say that he didn't get diagnosed until 2017. So that was a full 10 years after the first manic episode. Basically what had happened was he had gone down to Florida for a week-long intensive when he was in seminary. And the sort of topic of the intensive was about social justice in the church. His phone stopped working at some point in the middle of the week, and so he wasn't communicating with me, his grounding. And so staying up late, having conversations with people about God, about social justice and what we're being called to, not having me to talk to, is a really bad setup. And basically what happened was he wasn't sleeping, and one night he saw an owl who he believed told him that God was telling him to, that he hadn't done enough for God's people, and but that God was offering him an opportunity to be reborn into a world in which everything was healed, and he had God's grace, and all he had to do was jump in front of a truck. And so Travis stripped his clothes off and jumped in front of a truck. And again, completely miraculously, he survived. And there are so many times that God has just like tried just to save this man. But he was admitted into a psychiatric hospital, stayed there for a week, ultimately finally received a diagnosis of bipolar 1, which is the diagnosis where your first onset is with a manic episode. And so, this was, on the one hand, it was helpful because we finally had this diagnosis to explain things. but it's also incredibly scary. Now you have a chronic illness that has to be managed with medicine for the rest of your life. And it took years, really, for Travis he had years of anxiety after the diagnosis, that he would have another manic episode, and also that he wouldn't be able to have like a normal life or hold like a normal job. And that anxiety actually did sometimes make it hard for him to hold a normal job. And I will also say, though the medicines are essential for leveling out the intensity of the emotions, the other side of that is that leveling out, it changes a person. So Travis, once he started taking the medicines, not only did he not feel like himself, because he'd spent all these years feeling this intense way, he didn't feel like himself, but also he felt like he lost all the highs, right? That kept him safe, but he didn't join us in joy in the same way. And also he felt like he was losing his creative impulse. Once he became a counselor, he felt like he couldn't join people in their emotions in the same way. So there were various points at which Travis stopped taking his medicine the way that he should, just because he didn't feel like himself, and he wanted to believe that he didn't need it too, and I think this is probably pretty common with patients as well. This was a struggle. I could say more about that, but I'll just bring us up to the more recent history. So in June of last year, Travis had another manic episode. He had a bad counseling session and called me and said, "I'm sorry, I'm leaving you and the girls. Like, if I'm with you, I'll hurt you," which what he meant by that was that he was convinced that his presence in our lives was harmful. He also had a delusion, I'll say a little bit more about in just a second, that he could harm people with his thoughts. So he got hospitalized for a week, and it kind of became clear that he hadn't been taking his medicine correctly. And again, there was a kind of relief to that for me, because I was like, oh, okay, that he just needs to be taking his medicine correctly. That's why this one happened. The thing is that in the weeks leading up to Travis's death, the months really, he was taking his meds, because we had come to an agreement where I would watch him take them, which wasn't like the best situation for our marriage either, because he felt like I was being his mom, right? But so I knew he was taking them. He was going to therapy. He was seeing his psychiatrist. He was going on walks. He was doing all the things that you do. He was working so hard. He was compliant, as they say. But he was still spiraling. And what I would say was that the delusions that used to be confined to his manic episodes just became his everyday reality. He wasn't high, he wasn't low, he was just living in this really awful delusion. And basically the delusion that Travis had that the disease had constructed within him, and again, it's helpful then clarifying that people with bipolar disorder typically think that other people are mad at them, right? So Travis's delusion was that he was not only not good enough for God or God's grace, but that he was harming people with his thoughts and words. And this also sucked him away from us. Like I can tell you that over the last 2 years of his life, I lost Travis. I was like watching someone die of a disease over those years. And so in the months leading up to his death, he really was just stuck in his head. He could not be present. And in many ways, he couldn't be a functional parent. So my mom was already co-parenting with me before he died. I'm just gonna skip ahead just a second here. Okay, yeah, so his delusion also kind of expanded to the extent where, and this is similar, I guess, to people with bipolar disorder thinking that they have like power or control that they don't. So he actually believed that he was causing bad things to happen to to the people in his life, but also in the world. So he would have clients come into his office who were getting a divorce, or they lost their job, or they got a bad diagnosis, and he was starting to believe that he had caused those things in their lives. And his work as a counselor was therefore very, very stabilizing and challenging for him, because he would have these people come in, carrying all this pain, and he believed that he was the one causing it. So this was a source of really intense conflict between Travis and I, because I basically begged him to stop counseling. And he said, no, I can't. This is how I help people, right? Again, because he had this delusion that he wasn't doing enough to help people. And the pain was just a sign that he was doing the right thing, because Jesus suffered, so he should suffer. So obviously faith gets really complicated in all of this. I read somewhere that suicide from bipolar disorder happens when the physical energy of mania meets the self-loathing paranoia of depression, and I think that fits with what happened. And I don't know exactly what happened on the morning of his death, but given his previous manic episodes and the nature of his delusion, I think that Travis was led by a delusion that he was harming us, me and the girls in particular, and disappointing God. And either that God was offering him this portal that he had to jump through to be reborn into this healed reality, or that he needed to leave the world to protect us. It wasn't rational, and he wasn't in charge, which is why I think it's more appropriate to say that he died of bipolar disorder rather than suicide. And because Travis was living in a delusion that he was harming us, I think his leaving us was actually, in his mind, an act of love. And this brings me to my very final point that I hope we can talk about more. When people die by suicide, the people they leave behind can feel profound shame and guilt, because they feel like there's something they could have done to stop it, and they also worry that others blame them. They can also feel profound anger and pain, because they might feel that their love was not enough to keep that person there, or even that that person didn't love them enough to stay. And all of this can be unbearably painful and isolating. And it's part of what makes this kind of death uniquely difficult. So if you have someone in your community who is a survivor of suicide, and that's the language that can be used for someone who loses someone to suicide, they need to be reminded that they're not responsible for the other person's death, that their loved one didn't leave because there wasn't enough love, and instead that the delusions had created a reality in which that person thought they had no choice, and in which leaving actually protected the people behind them. Be willing to sit and listen and accept whatever feelings they bring, and that can be anger and sadness, it can be joyful remembering, but it can also be relief, because it's a hard thing to see someone suffer. And I can tell you that I go through moments in which I feel relief that he's not suffering anymore, as much as I miss him. I believe in grace beyond comprehension or boundaries. And it's the grace that Travis's illness kept him from accepting. And though that fact is ultimately what led to his death, I believe that he didn't have to accept God's grace to receive it. In Jesus, we see that God is willing to be embodied and suffer on this earth and alongside us, and to know intimately what it feels like to be human, and I would assume intimately what it feels like to have bipolar disorder. So I believe that God knew exactly what Travis was going through, better than anyone, and that he was never alone in his suffering. And I also believe that when Travis fell, that he fell into God's arms and into God's grace. And I think that's where everyone who dies by suicide falls. And I think if we believe or suggest anything else about how God understands suicide, that we fail to comprehend or appreciate the breadth and the depth of God's grace and love. Well, Ben and I were talking about maybe just Q&A. I don't know, does that work? Or did you want to pick up on anything I said? Or
I think I think exactly what you said was fabulous. Okay, we can, that way we can look at each other and talk at the same time.
That's good.
Exactly what you were saying as far as an individual who is acutely suicidal is so true with the idea that they're thinking, they may not be fully psychotic, where they are seeing things, hearing things, but their thinking is no longer based on reality. And they are convinced that is the only option. And it makes sense that Travis felt that he was protecting you, protecting your daughters, and his clients. And he took all that in, and that makes really good sense as well. But thank you for sharing. Anyone have questions or thoughts? I'll bring the microphone to you now.
Both of you mentioned something about bipolar 1, and so I actually kind of have two questions about what other types of bipolar there are, and then you talked about the age of diagnosis. I mean, is this something that can be evident during childhood, or no?
Great questions. The other type of bipolar is called bipolar 2. It's also called bipolar depression. And what it is, it's you don't ever have a manic episode with bipolar 2. You may have some hypomania, but you never have a full-blown manic episode. But it is very chronic depression that recurs and comes back. And so the movement is more between depressed and quote-unquote normal than it is depression and mania. And so bipolar 2 is you just never see mania happen. And so if you have never had a manic episode, but you've had maybe episodes of hypomania, then they may diagnose you with bipolar 2. And sometimes it's called recurrent depression, other things of that nature. The difference is for most people who have just straight major depressive disorder, theirs over time will can tend to kind of level out and not be as severe. With individuals with bipolar 2, they have recurrent episodes of it just being, what my clients used to call it, they would differentiate between a normal depressive episode, if you will, and being in the pit of despair. And that's how they would describe when they were in bipolar 2 depression, of being in that pit of despair, of being those times you just absolutely can't get out of bed, can't function, can't breathe, don't want to eat. As far as early age onset, certainly there's some research being done on that. It's harder there's some hesitancy. I mean, I've seen children diagnosed when it's really clear, but there's real hesitancy to do so, primarily because you want to really see what's going on. There's other reasons people can have manic episodes, especially as a child. And so they're hesitant to do so. And then the other thing is the medications. As Ashley said, medications are great, and they have horrific side effects, just horrific ones. That so it's a choice between no medication and chaos, and some medication that may be helpful, but it takes because of what it's designed to do is to take out the highs and lows. And so it keeps people feeling just more flat. And many of them describe feeling just flat, and it feels like they can't be creative, they can't experience joy, they don't experience sadness, they don't experience depression, but and so in the medication world, typically they will work to bring down the mania, because that's where the greatest risk of danger is, in the manic episodes. And so they will bring people down, and it's like, okay, well, the depression is awful, but you're alive. But is it a quality of life that people have, and many times they will describe as no. And so, and we're giving you, these horrible examples, and they're true, but I also have known people who do exceptionally well and can be exceptionally successful in life. It is not a guaranteed death sentence. It is I've seen people who have been on medication for years, and as they get into their 50s, 60s, and 70s, their medication level goes way down because they don't know, once again, is it the hormones? Is it, what is it? Because it's so complicated what's going on, what's in the brain. Is it that hormonal onset? And as you said, any kind of drug use can really trigger those kind of experiences from happening faster. Sometimes with children, or kind of the 10 to 12 or 13 to 15 age, you sometimes will see some manic episodes in there. Oftentimes those are drug induced as well. Not always, and so sometimes it can be diagnosed as young as 12, 13, 14, or even younger if there's a real clear biological family history. They're trying to do some research is being done trying to do preventive things, and it's really about brain health. They do a lot of things with fish oil and certain types of fish oil to really try to regulate things within the brain. The other thing that this is sometimes called for some folks is a fragile circadian rhythm disorder, which is a blah, 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 blah. It's not an official diagnosis, but it's really tied into that wake-sleep cycle, because that's one of the big triggers. Is if the wake-sleep cycle, if it's maintained, then the risk of having manic episodes goes way down. But truly, the lack of sleep can trigger it in a heartbeat. We see the time change is really, really hard for folks with bipolar disorder every year, especially the one in the spring. There's this whole cycle where folks who have a bipolar disorder, that they may have seasonal affective disorder as well, meaning they get more depressed in the fall and winter. And then February and March is really manic season, typically, because the sudden increase in sunlight will trigger manic episodes, or trigger heading towards that. And it can be very subtle. I've seen folks literally come in. I remember one lady who came in one day, and she had been working with myself and the medical provider, been working with her for months and years actually, and she came in and she looked completely different. And she was starting a manic episode. She had gone from being a quote unquote normal second grade teacher, who's what she was, to she came in and I'm like, oh my goodness, she works to school today. And it was questionable inappropriateness and about 5 times as much makeup as she's ever worn in her life, and presenting with this very engaging and almost seductive kind of discussion with myself and the medication provider. And it was because she was starting to have a manic episode as she was starting in the spring. And so it can be that subtle change.
I wanted to add to that too, that I know that when Travis had his manic episode in Florida, that his provider was saying it was in part due to the fact that all of a sudden he was in all of this sunshine. We lived in Bloomington, Indiana, and in the middle of January, he went to Florida, and he was spending all this time on the beach, and it was.
That is probably one of the strangest things, is see that sudden onset, and we see it every year, February and March, that sudden increase in sunset. And then really, people come in and start, hey, I'm really good day. It's strange, but it does happen. Great question. Other question. Let me come and bring it to you.
I should put it out there. I'm bipolar 2, and I've recently been told that I'm in full remission, so yay. But what you said about that place of love, where Travis did what he did out of love, I get that and I believe it, because your mind is so convinced that best thing that you can do for someone is to end yourself, because it is the ultimate sign of love, because they will be so much better without you. Some way, somehow, you convince yourself that. So, that just really touched me, because I truly believe that was a full intention, true love. It was what he meant to you.
Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you.
And yay for remission.
Scary.
I came late, so I don't know what's been said, but I have 3 family members that suffer from this. And one thing I've learned is that suicide is very common. It's frighteningly common. I've also learned that divorce is very common. I think you're amazing that you hung in there. I have seen that self-medication with alcohol is very common. I have seen that being angry with the people you trust the most, because you know they're going to forgive you, is very common. I have seen that the depression is so horrible that being manic seems fabulous. Because when you're so low, I can only speak for the experience I have had with these people I love, because it's different for everyone. But I do know that sleep cycles have a lot to do with it. That's been my experience too. Terrible financial decisions have been a part of that. Of 2 of the 3. Terrible financial decisions. I think a lot of times they go looking for other people to solve their problems, and I think that can be a problem with this disease. Not wanting to take your medicine because you really want to feel good for a while. And as you said about Travis, you want to be the person that you have been, instead of the person that's just level or even depressed. The depression is, to me, the depression is terrible. The hallucinations are bad. It's progressive. That's not encouraging, but it is. It's a fact that people need to understand, so that they know that they need to work harder to control it, because it will get harder. There are other symptoms, but I think those are some of the worst. I think you can love them as much as you can love them, but it's like so many things. They have to decide for themselves that they want to do what they have to do to live through it. It's a terrible, terrible, terrible disease. But I think you can live with it, and you're certainly a good example, and you're a good example, and you can. And there are other things there are other mental things that are horribly difficult too for people. So I'm not going to try to say this is the worst or anything, but I feel for sufferers, and I feel for people that love them.